Hi guys, my name is Callie and I have a story to share with you today that's a little bit crazy. Most of my friends didn't believe me when I told them, not unless I showed them the proof. I discovered the big secret our grandma was hiding, and since then, my life was never the same. When I arrived at my grandma's house, I was so excited. We spent the days after catching up with one another and she showed me around the house. That's when I spotted a door that used to lead to the garage. I went toward it and tried to turn the handle, but it was locked. That's when my grandma ushered me away and told me that I was never allowed to go into that room. I was a little creeped out at first. Why couldn't I go in there? Was Gran hiding something? But eventually I got over it. After all, I was probably reading too much into it. The next few days were pretty normal after that. But then one day it happened. I came down the stairs one morning to see my grandma looking really excited. She was nervously bouncing her good leg up and down and her face was lit up in a big smile. I was confused. She hadn't told me she had any plans or anything today. I shrugged my shoulders and figured she would tell me if it was important. But as I walked into the kitchen, she called me and asked me if I could go to the grocery store for her. I agreed straight away. After all, I was planning to look after her. That was my job. She thanked me and then gave me a really long list of items. Like super long. I stared down at it with an open mouth and a raised eyebrow. I wasn't sure we even needed all this stuff, or even if I could manage to carry it back by myself. But I didn't want to let my grandma down. If she needed me, I couldn't tell her no. She gave me her credit card and practically pushed me out the door to make my way to the store. It was all a bit bizarre, really, and I was confused by her strange behavior. But I wanted to make her proud, so I walked away down the street toward Main Street. It was then that I felt the first drop of rain hit my cheek. I looked up and saw the dark, gloomy clouds gathering above me, and I cursed. Damn it, just my luck. I headed back to go grab an umbrella and some warmer clothes. I didn't really think anything of it until I rounded the corner of the street and noticed there was another car on my grandma's driveway. I narrowed my eyes at it, at first thinking someone had parked there accidentally, but when I let myself into Grandma's house, I got a huge shock. My grandma sat in the living room wearing the strangest clothes I had ever seen. Her dress was a mixture of neon green and pink, and she was wearing a leather skirt. She had even done her makeup with bright red blush, and she was wearing a yellow hat with feathers. If that wasn't totally weird, she was also sat next to a man I didn't know. They were huddled together looking at something on her phone, and neither of them noticed me at first. I couldn't believe it. There was only one reason why my grandma would dress up and put on makeup. She must like that guy. It had been 4 years now since my grandpa had died. I never thought my grandma would ever be interested in someone else, and it was quite a shock. Still, I wanted to support her no matter, so I quickly headed upstairs to get what I needed before leaving again, unseen and unheard. I headed for the grocery store and completed the long shopping list. When I arrived back home again, the car was gone, and so was Grandma's mysterious visitor. When I went inside and saw her, she was dressed in her normal clothes again. A white sweater and baggy sweatpants. She'd even wiped all her makeup off. I felt a little bad. I didn't want her having to tiptoe around me with her new boyfriend. After all, this was her home. I wanted to make sure she knew I would support her no matter what. That's when I put my plan into motion. While my grandma was putting away the items I'd bought, I took a sneak peek in her phone and found the guy I was looking for. His picture matched the person I'd seen. His name in my grandma's phone was 𝗕𝗔𝗦𝗬𝗓. It seemed to confirm exactly what I'd thought. Why else would she call him her number one man? I got a glimpse of the messages between the two of them, but it didn't really reveal much more. They seemed to mostly arrange times to meet, but sometimes my grandma told him things like, "You're the best," and "I can't wait." It was clear that this Gerald guy was important to her and made her happy. It made me even more certain that I needed to show her she didn't need to hide anything. With Gerald's number handy, I texted him and told him he needed to come to the park around the corner from where we lived the next day at 6 p.m. sharp. He texted back asking who I was, and all I sent him back was a message saying, "Cupid." He called me a few times, and I ignored it. I knew it was a long shot, but if my plan worked, it would be a night my gran would never forget. The next day, I headed out to the park early with all my supplies. I decorated the trees with streamers and balloons. I nailed heart-shaped signs into the tree bark and draped some battery-operated lights over the picnic bench nearby. The scene looked incredible, like something right out of a romance novel. I took a picture of it to show my mom and dad later, before heading back to the house to collect my grandma. At first, my gran didn't want to go. She said she was looking forward to watching TV, but I insisted that we go for a walk in the park and that some fresh air would make her feel better. Eventually, she caved, and we made our way back to the park. It all worked out perfectly. Gerald stood waiting under the decorated trees when we arrived, and I helped my grandma walk up to him. The two of them both looked in total awe of what was going on. They stared at each other with wide eyes, and I was happy to see how I had surprised them. That is, until they both burst out laughing. "Oh gosh, Callie, what on earth is all this?" my grandma asked me while slapping her thigh and bending over from the force of her laughter. "This was your granddaughter? I thought it was another one of your crazy stunts, Jenny," Gerald said. I was so confused. Why was it all funny? I told them I wanted to support her to be happy with her new boyfriend. Once the words came out of my mouth, I instantly regretted them. It only made the two of them laugh harder. "Your granddaughter is quite the craftsman. There are enough hearts here to make even a grown man like me swoon," Gerald exclaimed. The two of them were in fits of laughter. As my grandma wiped happy tears from her eyes, she turned to me and shook her head. "Gerald is not my boyfriend, honey," she told me with a smile and then turned to usher me home. She told me it was about time she confessed her little hobby to me, and I could not have been more confused. What the hell was going on? When we got home, my grandma took me to the room I was not allowed to go in. I assumed it was a storage room for something precious, or that she had been redecorating. But boy, was I wrong. Inside, there was a whole studio with expensive lights, cameras, and even a makeup station. There were clothes littered around the room, including designer labels. Wow! What is all this? I asked. My grandma confessed that she is an Instagram. I had never felt so freaked out in my entire life. I asked her what on earth was an Instagram. She told me that she has been posting crazy fashion pictures on Instagram of herself for 2 years now, and she has a crazy huge number of followers, like in the millions. I thought she was teasing me. I told her to prove it, and well, she did. She showed me her account on her phone, and I gasped in surprise. It was all real. There was my gran in crazy and outrageous pictures on Instagram. She was wearing bright clothing and doing strange things. Like in one picture, she was posing as a ringleader at a circus with what looked like a real-life tiger. Another one featured her wearing a designer bathing suit and diving into the ocean. There was even one of her clinging to a stripper pole in a nightclub. I couldn't believe my eyes. My grandma was leading this whole separate life I'd had no idea about. And it was a fun one by the looks of it. I stared at her and I must have looked insane. I felt like the ground was crumbling beneath me. This was huge! Grandma told me she broke her leg in an extreme photo shoot, and she didn't tell my parents because she knew they'd go crazy at her for some of the mischief she gets up to. But she told me it was the most fun thing she'd done since her husband died, and it gave her a reason to get up in the morning. It makes me feel less lonely, she told me with tears in her eyes. My heart sunk in my chest. I couldn't bear to see her looking so upset. I smiled at her and told her I understood, and I wanted her to do whatever made her happy. But what about Gerald? I asked. She told me Gerald was her manager, who helped her network with fashion designers and gain access to cool locations for shoots. I couldn't believe it! Number one man was short for number one manager. I felt so stupid. It may seem unbelievable, but my grandma really is an Instagram model, and a famous one at that. It might be weird or strange to other people, but I really admire her courage and confidence. My grandma inspires me every day to follow my dreams and not let age or fear or anything like that stop me from being the best I can be. So tell me what you think in the comments below.
I felt a weird tingling sensation in my legs when I woke up alone, restrained to an operating table without a clue what was happening. I looked around and saw myself hooked up to lots of machines and had a drip in my arm. And the worst thing was, I had no idea where I was. It was like I had been drugged or my memory had been wiped without a clue where I've been before this moment. This was the scariest moment of my life. I had no idea what to do. I felt a sharp pain in my stomach. My head felt fuzzy and my mouth was dry. I tried to shout out for help, but my voice just came out as a croak. I couldn't move my limbs. I was so frightened. I was all alone and no one could hear me call for help. After a few minutes, a woman came into the room. She was dressed in a white robe and her face was covered in a white mask. She looked like a nurse you'd see in a horror movie. Was I in a hospital? When she noticed that I was awake, she started talking to me in a language I didn't understand. Her tone was weird and aggressive, and I had no idea what she was saying. I started moving my hands and legs, trying to release myself from the machines I was hooked up to. "Get me out of here!" I screamed in pain. But the terror didn't stop there. The scary woman walked over to me and pulled back the blanket covering me and lifted up my gown, which revealed a large bandage on my stomach. What had they done to me? I cried and started to scream louder. With a quick move, I managed to release my hand and I ripped the bandage off even though it hurt and saw a fresh scar and stitches underneath. I had been cut open. All kinds of thoughts started racing through my head. Maybe I had been drugged and someone had taken me to sell my organs on the black market. Or maybe I had been kidnapped and was going to be held for ransom until my mom and dad paid the kidnappers their life savings. Or maybe I'd be murdered and my family would never find my body. It was then that I completely lost it. I screamed more and more and started kicking and hitting out at the nurse. I have to say I'm not usually a violent person. I was just so frightened that I lost all control. Then an even worse pain set in and I looked down at my stomach where the pain was coming from. My stitches had blood coming out of them. The nurse pressed an alarm and more nurses ran in. 2 of them strapped my arms down and another strapped down my legs. I was now really frightened. I was trapped and they could do whatever they wanted to me and I was powerless to stop them. Then a doctor came in and got close to the bed. He was tall and had a mean look on his face. Then he did something that made me even more scared. I was so busy looking at his face that I didn't see what he did, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I didn't know what it was, but my vision started to blur and I slowly started falling asleep. He must have given me something to knock me out. I couldn't move and I couldn't resist it anymore. My eyes closed and I was powerless to open them. I didn't know how much time had passed before I woke up the second time, but when I looked beside me, I saw a plate of food that looked weird. I made a guess that this food was for me. Everything they were serving looked mashed and smelled disgusting, but I was very hungry and ended up eating most of it. The room was empty and the drug's effect was wearing off, and that's when I started to remember where I was last before I came here. I knew I wasn't in my home country because not too long ago I was traveling abroad with my 2 besties, Ali and Dahlia, for my 14th birthday. We weren't alone though, my father came with us. My head hurt and I started panicking again when the memory was coming back to me. I knew I was with them not too long ago in the streets of Malaysia. We were eating fried squids from a food chain, but something really bad had happened. The streets were so crowded, and as I was walking with my father and friends, I started feeling a sharp pain in my stomach after all the food I ate. I assumed that it was normal because I was trying out new food, and that's when my father and 2 friends had disappeared. I couldn't see them anymore, and I became very anxious as the pain in my stomach got worse and worse. And that was the last thing I remembered, being lost in a foreign country alone, which explained the whole situation I was in at the moment. Obviously, a gang had kidnapped me after noticing how clueless and lost I was. Oh my god, everything was finally making sense, and I started getting into a state of terror I never felt before. I needed to get out of there right now. My thoughts were disturbed as another person came in. It was the same woman with the white mask, and this time she had pills in her hands that she wanted me to take. When I said no, 2 other men came in and I knew I had to do it, so I decided to play it smart and took the pills and hid them under my tongue and spit it out as soon as they left the room. At that moment, I knew I had to find a way to leave this place, and that's exactly what I did the next morning. After I woke up, a man with a blue mask was standing over me. I was dizzy and felt too weak to move despite being super scared. I looked at the person standing over me with tears in my eyes and asked him politely if I could leave. I begged him in hopes that he'll feel sorry enough for me to let me go. To my shock, this guy with the blue mask called another man who seemed to speak some English, and when I repeated that I needed to leave, he told me with a loud voice, "Money or no leave." "I don't have any money," I screamed, and he replied, "This a big problem. Your mom and dad will pay." It seemed like it didn't matter how much I begged them to let me go. They couldn't care less about my well-being. Only God knows what they would do to me if I didn't pay them. Would they hurt me? Or had they already started removing my organs to sell? I started crying, even though I tried to talk and reason with the man. I couldn't help it. I just cried and cried. Eventually, the 2 men gave up and left me alone in the room. After a while, I managed to calm myself down and realized what I needed to do. I had to escape. My arms and legs were still restrained and they were really tight, but after a lot of wriggling, I managed to pull my left arm free. Then I managed to undo the restraints on my right arm and my legs. I sat up. I felt lightheaded and my stomach hurt, but I didn't care. I looked down at myself. I was just wearing a gown and my feet were bare. I looked around the room and saw a bag with some clothes and shoes which looked kind of familiar. I tried to get out of bed, but I felt a sharp pain in my arm. I looked at it and saw the drip still attached. I pulled it out and had to stifle a scream. It hurt so much, and my blood spurted across the room as it came out. Somehow I managed to put on the clothes and shoes. I opened the door a crack. It was an empty corridor outside. I knew this could be my only chance before my kidnappers came back. I ran out of the room and down the corridor. I got to the end and there was a door I pushed open. On the other side were loads of people and beds and surrounded by people in masks and robes. The 2 men who had shouted at me were there too. When they saw me, they ran towards me. They looked so angry. I looked around. I needed to get out. I saw a door leading outside. I ran to it and flung myself against it. I was so dizzy that I could barely hold myself up. I fell outside in a heap on the floor, but I knew I couldn't stop. I stood up and started running. I was in a country that I knew nothing in. Everything looked foreign. The buildings looked different, the cars looked different, and so did the people. I honestly had no plan of how I should get by. But that didn't matter. I just knew that I needed to get away from the place I was being held captive in. I got up and ran, even though I could hear shouting behind me. But after a while, my legs gave way and I collapsed on the floor. I couldn't get up, so I started to crawl, but soon I felt arms around me. I screamed and shouted that I was being kidnapped, but everyone carried on and ignored me. Soon I felt a stabbing pain in my arm again, and it all went dark. As the light was fading, I just felt that this was the end. I wanted to give up. It was dark for a long time before something really strange happened. I woke up after I heard loud voices in my room. When I opened my eyes, I saw that there were 3 policemen standing over there and chatting with my kidnappers. Oh my God! They kidnapped me! I screamed, but the policemen looked like they had no idea what I was saying. How could this situation even be real? They need to catch these bad guys and help me find my parents. But suddenly, I heard familiar voices, and then my mom and dad came in a hurry through my door. They looked so relieved to see me. My mom even started crying, and my kidnappers were standing right beside them, smiling. I screamed, "They kidnapped me!" But that's when my father and mother started laughing and called me silly. "These are doctors," my parents said. Then they explained that I wasn't kidnapped. It was something totally different. After I got lost the other day, my dad couldn't find me, and when he got back to the place I was gone. Apparently, as I was panicking while suffering from severe pain in my stomach, I had fainted on the sidewalk and I had to be transmitted to a hospital quickly. Later on, the doctors discovered that my appendix had burst. They said that the shock, stress, and new food I ate must have affected it. It also took my parents a while before they actually figured out where I was, which had also given them their own share of stress. Eventually, I was super glad that this whole nightmare passed. And I had to apologize so many times to the doctors who were treating me for the hard time I gave them. Have you ever been rushed to a hospital? Or maybe you've been in a situation similar to mine?